texts provide their own challenges. I suppose the main challenge always is finding the right wavelength for them, tuning into them, I suppose, if you like. Finding a response that illuminates rather than merely setting. I think I've got a fairly well-developed routine, let's say, for setting language in terms of, particularly setting English, which I've done many times. I'm quite resourceful about finding good ways to accentuate and where to put melismas and all those technical kinds of things are not a problem for me because I've done it enough and I've, I guess, studied enough vocal pieces that do that really well that I think it's not something that I find problematic. So it's really the next step beyond that of finding the wavelength, finding the emotional resonance. Often that has a lot more to do, or it's got at least as much and sometimes more to do with the accompaniment than it does with the solo line. How harmony and texture move underneath a vocal utterance is really, really important. And maybe I'm kidding myself, but I sort of feel that, you know, if I move like a note this way or that way or slightly change the voicing of a chord, it actually makes a huge difference as to how apt the setting of the words is emotionally. I think that was most acute for me in the opera for Highway Peter that I did a couple of years ago, where I really did feel, of course, in opera it's an even more extreme case because you're dealing with a dramatic situation that involves multiple characters and you're sustaining a narrative that's going for an hour or more. But I really did feel that, you know, F sharp, no, wrong mood. Take it up a semitone to G natural, now we're talking. Move that chord one quaver later, makes all the difference. All of those things, it's something that I often talk to my students about in a general sense, not just with pieces that involve text, but actually with instrumental pieces as well. There's a huge difference to my mind between the right kind of thing and the right thing. And I think that as I've matured as a composer, what I've got better at is finding the right thing as opposed to merely the right kind of thing. You know, for example, you may know that a line needs to go up, and so you could write a scale going upwards, and that would do the job. But that's likely to be the right kind of thing. You find a couple of places to put kinks in that line as it ascends, and all of a sudden you're on the track of what might be the right thing. Finding text is something that I used to find really difficult. I used to have no idea. I got quite a bit of mileage when I was in my sort of late teens, early 20s out of one anthology that we happened to have at home that was, I think it must have been assembled for high school teaching purposes because it had a whole lot of poems from different periods arranged by subject matter, not by poet. And it seemed that they'd chosen poetry that had some very direct, beautiful, expressive kernel to it. And so I got texts of probably about 4 or 5 pieces from poets as early as the 17th century and as recent as the mid-20th century out of that anthology. And so that put me onto, I guess, one way of looking for poetry in particular is to go looking for anthologies rather than setting out with an idea of what you might want to find. And I've sort of pursued that in a variety of different ways. Sometimes I've come across a poet whose work I really like, maybe in a setting by another composer. One specific example, in John Adams' work El Nino, he sets a big sort of chorus orchestra piece. He sets a lot of wonderful poetry by Latin American poets, and I didn't know anything about Latin American poetry, but I remember being particularly struck by a poem by a Chilean poet that I'd never heard of prior to that, by the name of Vicente Huidobro. And so I thought, that's kind of cool. I wonder if I can sort of go looking for other stuff that he's done. And I found an anthology and found some fantastic poetry that was absolutely what I needed for a particular purpose. So, you know, it's following up all sorts of random leads like that. The internet makes things easier, of course. You can now sort of go out and Google and search for things. I think for example, that the poem I set for the Kingfisher songs, The Pleiades at Midnight, I think I found by Googling, and I'd never heard of Johannes Carsten Hauch, it was an obscure 19th century Danish poet, but I found this lovely text and ran with it from there. It was definitely harder in the days before the internet. You had to do more legwork and be digging things up in libraries. But another thing that I've done a few times is come across a text for which I have no immediate use and thought, bottom drawer for that. Let's sort of hang on to that, because maybe the time will come when that text might be useful. There was an example I came across. This was a setting for a choral work I wrote for a choir in San Francisco a few years ago. And this was a text that I came across in a musicology lecture given by one of my fellow faculty members at Harvard when I was there. It was a lecture about 17th century attitudes to the voice. And there was this extraordinary text that basically from a religious point of view, it was basically saying what a vile, worthless thing the voice is. The lips gives birth to it, and it dies as soon as it reaches the listener's ear. There's this whole list of vile insults directed at the voice, and it finishes, something like shadow, breath, nothing, just like lists of single words at the end. The paradox, of course, being that it's so incredibly powerfully expressed. And in fact, it's expressed, although it's a written text, it's just like, as delivered by the voice, it's just the most extraordinary utterance. And for what more, what better text for a choral piece? The piece is called Voice and Nothing More, and in the original context, that's a put down. But in the context of the piece, it becomes a celebration of what the voice is capable of all on its own. I would say that in most cases when I've set text, it's been things that I've felt a real connection with. Every now and then, though, that I've been in a circumstance where I was assigned a text that I didn't necessarily feel a very close association with. And in those cases, I found what I had to do was remake the text somehow, find an angle on it that worked for me. The example that I'm thinking of, the most specific one, I was approached some years ago to contribute to a project which involved choral settings of a particular Mormon hymn. The hymn is in 4 stanzas, and each finishes with a refrain. And I thought, how about I actually set them simultaneously, not successively? So I overlaid the 4 stanzas. In fact, it's done quite strictly. The basses have the first stanza, the tenors the second, the altos the third, the sopranos the fourth. But they come in almost sort of in fugal imitation, if you like. So the basses stretch the text out. So the idea is that all 4 parts end up on the refrain at the same moment, but they've got there at very different speeds coming in at different times. And what that then meant was that I had all of these possibilities of counterpoint between the different verses of the hymn. I'm happy to write things that are challenging, providing that I think that the performers will think the challenges are worth surmounting. I've certainly written pieces, for example, I've written pieces for both Michael Kieran-Harvey and Zubin Kanga, who are new music piano virtuosi of rather different character, but they would be disappointed if I wrote something easy for them. And so, I certainly pulled all the stops out in the pieces that I've written for those 2 performers. With the pieces that I've written for you and for Alison, it's not so much about making them as difficult as I possibly could. It's more about a certain kind of relish, maybe, in the way that text rolls off the tongue, in the way that melisma might float through the registers of the voice. I try and make things that will be enjoyable to sing, because let's face it, the performers are the first and most critical and most, like it or not, the audience that's going to be spending by far the longest with this music. So if it works for the performers, then it's quite likely that they will make it work for an audience. And if they're not convinced by it, then why would they be bothered spending the time?